having shown Gideon now at this point, right there, Chad, perfect, that no test was going to bolster his faith in him, God puts Gideon in a situation where he literally could do nothing else but have faith in God, as we're going to see through chapter 7 today. We've seen now with Gideon this kind of pattern in his life that he just requires physical evidence of God's existence, right? Because he doesn't have the faith that he should have. He requires of God some things to help satisfy or ease his mind about the task that was ahead for him that God had required him to do. Now, of course, we can say Gideon should have, as soon as the angel of the Lord showed up and told him what to do, Gideon should have jumped up and took off and did exactly what he was supposed to do. That's not the case. I don't think that would have been the case for us either. But we have seen growth in Gideon's life as we have moved through these verses. We see a man that at the very beginning of this was as scared as he could be, right? As scared as he could possibly be, as cowardly as he could possibly be, looking for every reason to not do what God had asked him to do. But we've seen him grow in faith, I would say exponentially, as he has moved through and getting ready to lead this army to fight against the enemy that he has before him, the Midianite army that he has before him. And we will continue to see some of that fear creep into Gideon today through chapter 7. But we will also see, as we kind of move through this, when Gideon does finally act by faith, Gideon does finally kind of put his full trust and faith in God, just exactly some pretty miraculous things that took place, and pretty cool things that happened because of this. So just to jump back into where we're at here, of course, Gideon has an army of about 32,000 men. Okay, that's who's in his army. And they are joining him beside the well of Herod. Dawn has now broken. All right. And in its light, the Israelites can now kind of look out and see the very well trained, very well prepared, much larger, much more intimidating looking Midianite armies, and they are by the hill of Morah. 150,000, whatever it was we saw last week. It's 4-1 outnumber. The Midianite army outnumbers the Israelites. So this is quite the task ahead of them. Pretty much impossible odds. Seeming even more impossible as the sun continues to rise, and the expanse of the army grows greater and greater. And we actually see Gideon kind of in the Lord having another conversation. All right, so let's jump into verse number 1. And let's read down to verse number 7 of chapter 7. Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Herod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, my own hand hath saved me. Now therefore go to proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. The Lord said to Gideon, the people are yet too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So they brought down the people into the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, every one that lappeth up with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, everyone that boweth down upon his knees to drink, and a number of them that lapped, putting their hand to the mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thy hand, and let all the other people go, every man unto his place. All right, so 32,000 Israelites are there, and God comes back to Gideon and has another conversation with him. And again, 4-1, the Israelites are outnumbered by the Midianites. And God shows up to Gideon and tells him that there are how many Israelites? Too many, right? There's just simply too many Israelites. I'm not going to deliver the Midianites into all of these people, because what will the Israelites say after I allow them to win the battle? That they did this, right? The Israelites did this. The reason they defeated the Midianite army was because they were powerful, or the ability that they had, or some other reason they would give that they won. And God says to Gideon, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to have that. There's too many people here. They will think that they did this on their own accord. So this is what I want you to do, Gideon. I want you to go up in front of the 32,000 and just simply say to them, if you're scared, go home. If you don't want to be here, if you're worried at all, if you have any fear, any second thoughts about this, I want you to go ahead and just go back to the house, because there are no use to us here. Now, the Lord knew that Gideon himself, right, not just the Israelites, but Gideon himself, he knew that Gideon still did not fear or respect him enough to simply just trust him, right? Even at this point, we've seen Gideon grow. We've seen his faith grow. We've seen him mature in his relationship with God, but he was still not where God wanted him to be. And he was still not in a position to fully just turn over, yeah, whatever, Lord, if you want me to go fight the 100 and some thousand. He wasn't to that point, right? And God knew that, so he's putting him through more tests of his faith. He knew that even at this point with his 32,000 Israelites, that he was not fear him enough to simply trust him. So the Lord begins to reduce the army. 2 different tests. The first one, he tells Gideon, again, simply just tell the people who are scared to go home. Do you think when God tells Gideon this, Gideon, go out amongst the people, ask them if they're scared, tell them to go home. Do you think Gideon thought for a second, maybe I could just get out of here too, right? I'm sure that was the thought. Right? You know it was. Well, I'm a little bit scared myself. Do I get to go home? And that was the first test to reduce the army. And we see that a whole bunch of them were fearful. And Gideon, probably totally honest, would have left with the rest of the faithless, fearful comrades as well. So we see exactly how many people did not, right? The fact that 20,000 or whatever it was that left, exactly 22,000, that left, we also see the state of their spirituality as well, right? Because these are Israelites, these are God's chosen people. Gideon's came to him and says, hey, God says we're going to win this battle. So they the war call, all gather up. When it gets down to where rubber meets the road, right, or I guess wheel meets the dirt in this case, we see that there's 22,000 Israelites, God's chosen people, who don't have faith in God. That's exactly what this is, right? It's not, God is giving Gideon a test to strengthen his faith in him, yes. But he's also showing Gideon and showing us as the reader of this and the studier of this, that there are 22,000 other Israelites who are just as faithless as Gideon was when God first showed up. Because they took off and ran as well. Gideon says, if you're scared, go home. Now, all 32,000 of those Israelites should have known the stories that have already happened, right? All the other judges that have come up and done all these miraculous things. What Deborah just managed to do a couple decades ago, right? They should have known these stories, should have learned these things, should have understood how God has taken care of this now on numerous occasions. But because they had fallen so far, because the mommies and daddies hadn't taken time to teach the children the importance of what God was, the importance of faith in God, the importance of being obedient to God, because all of these areas the Israelites have failed, we see a generation of people who still have no faith in the most powerful creator in all the world, in all the universe. 22,000 people just leave simply because they're afraid of what might happen. Again, it gives us the spiritual state of the Israelites. And it's still, God is using this to teach Gideon more lessons and to improve his faith in him and to strengthen his faith in him as well. We then get to the second part of this story, which is Pippa's favorite part. The test with drinking water, right? He then sends, all right, there's 10,000 more of you. Let's take them down to the brook or down by the river, and tell them to grab a drink of water, right? And see how they drink the water up. And then from there, we'll kind of minimize the forces even more. Okay, so he instructs them down to drink the water out of the brook or the river, and we notice that 300 of the Israelite army would reach down and scoop the water up with their hand and put it into their mouth, and then the other 9,700, right, were sticking their face into the water and kind of sucking it up like a dog would. And those were the select fighting men that God left over. That was the ones, that 300 men that God wanted to use in fighting against the Midianites. Gideon's army went from being outnumbered 4-1 at the start of these two tests to now being outnumbered 450-1. Now, perhaps those who lapped the water were more alert because of the position that they put themselves in. Right? If you're drinking or using water, you can see your surroundings, right? You're more aware of things going on. As far as just sticking your face in there, you're not as aware of what's going on. Perhaps that was the reason God chose those 300 men in a position better to see the enemy approaching. But even then, like, they weren't in immediate. They're going through this test. There wasn't immediate danger. Right? They weren't in the throes of war when this happened. More likely, God chose these 300 men who least wanted to be chosen and would be most likely to leave once the battle started. Maybe that's the reason he had this test. The passage actually says, if we go down to verse number 8, so the people took victuals in their hands and trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man into his tent, and did what? What's that word there? Retained, right? And retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian was beneath him. The passage says here that Gideon retained them. The word retained is an idiom that actually means, like when we in the education system, right? When a child is not doing as well as he should or she should or they should, as they are in class, and we decide as the teachers or the administration or whoever decides to keep them back so they can take the class again. Now, in your all's day, you all called that what? Failing, right? You weren't smart enough to go on, you failed. Now we call that retaining the children, right? We retain them, keep them back lots of times against their own will, sometimes against the parents' will, okay? Because they have to go through the process to make sure they get enough stuff to learn. Didn't pass the SOL test, so on. So the word, it's interesting that the translation there uses the word retaining, okay? What does a retaining wall do? It holds back whatever's behind it, right? Kind of keeps it back. The dirt wants to move, right? But the retaining wall retains it and keeps it back. So this little test here, per the scriptures, is probably these 300 guys were more scared than the other ones. That's why they were kind of lapping it up with their, kind of looking around and doing the things the way that they were. And God tells Gideon that he wants to retain those 300 men, kind of keep them against their will, essentially. Gideon here is left with 300 men who were a flight risk, right? Jump over to Exodus with me, and you kind of see why. I'll show you why I translate this, or why it's translated this way. You can go to chapter 9 and verse 2. Exodus chapter 9 and verse 2. For if thou refuse, let's read verse 1 too, just for context. Then the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh and tell him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, and that they may serve me. Verse 2. For if thou refuse to let them go, and wilt hold them still, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle which is in the field, upon the horses, the asses, camels, upon the ox, upon the sheep, and there shall be grievous rain. Right? Same concept here in verse number 2. The word retained here, referring to the children of Israel, when we see that they, for if thou refuse to let them go, and wilt hold them still, is holding the children of Israel. Pharaoh is holding them against their will. They don't want to stay in Egypt, right? But he is making them, forcing them to stay. Same context, same type of language used here in Exodus. So, say all that to say this: Gideon's left with 300 men who probably aren't the best fighters, right? They're probably not if we're rolled into a battle, we don't want these 300 dudes on our side. But very specifically purposed, God has this here, right? As we'll, of course, know, and as we will continue to see. Gideon's left with 300 men who are a total flight risk, and God had Gideon right where he wanted him. What is the only thing that Gideon can do here? Trust God, right? Literally the only thing he can do is trust God. God's got him kind of in a position. He's backed him into a corner, essentially, that the only thing he's able to do is have total faith in God, put all of his faith and trust in him. And to finally bring Gideon to the point of fearing him above everything else, right? God tells Gideon to go to the camp of the Midianites because he has delivered them into Gideon's hand. Back to chapter 7 of Judges and go to verse number 9. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, Arise, get thee down unto the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. What is the instructions that God gives Gideon here? Go where the enemy is, right? Don't stand up on the hill and watch them. Don't just kind of get out where you can scout them. Walk your scared behind right into the middle of the camp, okay? And do that at dark, right? Now, from TV shows, movies you've seen, anything, old-timey war, ancient history wars like this, what is going on a lot of times at night in these war camps? All kinds of crazy stuff, right? There's just the men are passing time, and they're drinking, they're gambling, they're carrying on, they're doing all the kind of different things that you would you see and kind of hear about, or that you've seen on movies or whatever. That's the same things going on here, right? They're not all just all buttoned up, probably in their tents and so on and so forth. There's probably things. Gideon, he's going to walk in and see the strength here of the Midianite army, right? He's going to go in and see the strength of the Midianite army. And if you go down to verse 10, God, but if thou fear to go down, go with a few of thy servant, down with the host. So he tells them, if you don't want to go by yourself, take your servant with you and go into the midst of the host of this army and see exactly what was going on. Now, God goes on here in a second to tell Gideon that he would hear what the Midianites say and that their message would strengthen his hand to fight the Midianites. Gideon, of course, takes his servant with him as an indication that he's still pretty scared and does not want to take God at his word. Verses 11 and 12. And thou shalt hear what they say, and afterward shalt thy hands be strengthened to go down unto the host. Then went he down with fury his servant unto the outside of the armed men that were in the host, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for the multitude. And their camels were without number, as they stand by the seaside for multitude. God tells Gideon to go down, right? And Gideon is going to have to get close enough, right? This is an interesting thing here. I think sometimes gets overlooked. In order for Gideon not to get help with the battle, right? God tells him in verse number, I had it marked where to go. Verse 11, thou shalt hear what they say, right? And when you hear what they say, afterwards shall thine hands be strengthened. So in order for Gideon's hands to be strengthened in battle, what must Gideon do? Has to hear. What do you have to do to be able to hear a conversation? You got to be close enough to hear it, right? He has to be within earshot. Now, we know now, if you continue into the context, they look like grasshoppers. There's so many camels they can't be counted. There's all these things, all the clamoring, all this stuff's going on in this camp. And Gideon's going to have to infiltrate and get close enough to be able to hear conversations that are going on within the camp of this army. Gideon is going to have to walk amongst the enemy, right? That's essentially what Gideon's going to have. God's telling him, go down, walk amongst the enemy. Now, if Gideon would have just gotten down 300 yards away and looked and tried to listen and couldn't hear anything and then went back, would Gideon have had success in the battle to come? No. He wouldn't have, right? Because God explicitly says, you will get strength once you hear what they have to say. So the whole time as Gideon and Fury are walking down there, he's probably thinking, let's take a step. Oh, can't hear him yet. Can't hear him yet, right? Can't hear him yet. Finally, I'm close enough that I can hear what's going on. All right, we're good. Okay? So that is what is required. God is continuing to test, continuing to push Gideon closer and closer and closer to the edge of his faith, right? That's what he's doing here. So, as we see, starting down in verse number 13, and when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow and said. So Gideon gets the courage up, he and his servant, they're close to a tent. I would think, this is a total Lanceism, this was the very last tent on the very edge of the camp, the very first one he could get to. That's kind of how I see this happening. And him just creeping in close enough that he could hear what was going on. But he hears this being said. Behold, I dreamed a dream, verse 13, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it that the tent lay along. And his fellow answered and said, there is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. And it was so, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian. So Gideon gets close enough to this tent to hear this private conversation between two of these soldiers. One is telling the other about a dream of a loaf of barley that he had. The barley came rolling into the camp and destroyed a tent. The other soldier hears the dream, interprets the dream, and says, there is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. Now, Midianites, secular people, pagan people, worship Baal, worship Asheroth, didn't worship God, knew that they were warring against the Israelites. But somewhere, at some point, these two men, right, have one, heard of Gideon, two, knew the army was up there. They obviously were there ready to fight for a reason. They knew the war was going on. They knew who was in charge as well. Obviously, the two warring commanders probably would have known that. But obviously, divine intervention here. God puts this dream on this soldier, gives this interpretation to this other soldier, and Gideon is standing right where he's at, and hears this one enemy tell the other enemy that the only person that can beat us is Gideon. Right? And finally, we see cowardly Gideon set the wool dry and the ground wet. Set the ground wet, and the wool dry. Burn up this offering. Give me these men. Show me all these things. Give me Gideon. Finally, we see him come to full faith. It took him having to walk down into the enemy, hear his enemy saying, only Gideon can beat us. And him thinking, only I can beat you, right? And we see him now running back up at the end of verse 15 and telling the 300 Israelites that are there, God is going to deliver us the Midianites. Key word here in verse number 15. Right? There is a key word here in verse number 15. And what do you think that key word is? And it was so when Gideon heard. Right? And it was so that when Gideon heard. When he heard that, just as God has required him, you're going to have to get close enough to hear and listen. He had to hear. That then turns the tide, essentially, for Gideon. Go ahead, Chad. Hit that one time for me, please. Should bring up. Is there another one? I thought there might have been one more. Keep going. No, go back. We're good. Can go back one. Is there a slide in between that? There, perfect. All right. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hands. There's another key thing that happens here, right? The first key thing is that he heard because he was where he was supposed to be, right? What is the initial or the very first response of Gideon after he hears these two enemy soldiers talking? Does he run straight back to the camp? What does the verse say? What's the first thing that he does? Worships God, right? The very, very, very first thing that he does when he finally kind of grows into his own, he gives God glory. He thanks him. He worships him for what is getting ready to happen. And then he goes back up and tells the Israelites, hey, we are going to win this thing because God says that we are going to win this thing. Gideon, for the entirety of this story, for the 2 chapters we've been studying him, Gideon has had what type of problem? A hearing problem, right? God said, go do this. And he said, I need some more. God says, go do this. I need some more, right? He will not simply just listen and do. He's had a hearing problem this entire time. He has refused to listen to God's clear-cut, concise directions on several occasions. But when he heard the Midianites state his faith in God's message, which came through his companion's dream, he realized just how foolish he had been. If a pagan man who does not worship God believed God after such a weird message, then certainly Gideon could believe in God's word too. So we see him worshiping him instantly. He then returns to the Israelite a brand new man. Confronted his reluctant army, right? His 300 flight risk guys that could leave at any time. He comes to them and tells them, verse 15, arise, the Lord hath delivered you into the hand. God's battle with Gideon, who has taken us now 2 chapters, right? God finally wins the battle with Gideon. Taught him to have faith in him and to fear him above all else. Verses 16 through 24, go ahead, Chad, bring us to B, gives us the result now of Gideon's faith in God. Now, verse 16, let's finish this up. We've got about 10 minutes. Verse 16, Gideon issues the soldiers each 3 items, right? Verse 16, he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put a trumpet in every man's hand, an empty pitcher, and lamps within the pitchers. And said unto them, look on me, and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that I do, so shall ye do. When I blow with the trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Make a note of that. It's going to be important in just a second. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the middle of the watch, and they had newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hand, and the 3 companies blew trumpets and brake the pitchers and held their lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, the sword of the Lord, and of Gideon. And they stood, every man in his place, round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Beth-shittah and Zerath, and to the border of Abel-Maholah unto Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, and out of Asher, and out of all Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all of Mount Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites, and take before them the waters of Beth-barah and Jordan. That all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters into Beth-barah and Jordan. Right? So Gideon issues each soldier 3 items: a trumpet, a ram's horn trumpet, a lamp or a torch. This would have been a wooden torch that had fire on it, obviously, and that was going to be hidden in a clay pitcher or a clay jar. Now, as mentioned earlier, and we've known this, the Midianites probably confiscated pretty much all of Israelites' weaponry, right? They pretty much got all of their swords and spears and shields, and they have pretty much everything after the 7 years of oppression. But the Lord's presence, of course, here is more than compensating for the Israelites' lack of weaponry. Now, following Gideon's lead, the Israelite army, because there's only 300 of them, right, very stealthily approaches the Midianite camp and performs 4 very unusual things, especially in the middle of a battle. Right? If you're going to start a fight, right? 4 very unusual things. Following Gideon's lead, the first thing they did was what? Blow the trumpets, right? The first thing that they blew their 300 trumpets into the quiet night air. 300 trumpets sounding off, going to awaken everybody who isn't awake in the camps. The 300 trumpets going off, it's going to be kind of loud, especially those ram horns. They don't really sound like the trumpets that we play. It's got a little different beat to it, a little different sound to it. So that would have woken these men up. The second thing, which I think this is kind of cool if you think about it. All at one time, 300 pitchers break, right? And you've dropped a pitcher on the lathe in a glass. When one of those, I know at school, when we drop this small 250 milliliter glass beaker and it hits the ground by accident, it shatters. It's loud. Like, it's really, really loud. You can imagine 300 of those things happening all at the same time. That's going to be quite the sound, right? It really is. It's going to be quite the sound. And they would have, all at the same time, all those things would have broken, right? So then you got guys awake, they hear this, and they're startled, right? The enemies are startled, looking around. That sound alone would have been very, very threatening. The third thing was that all 300 men in unison shouted out, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. If we will jump right back up to verse number, where is it at? 14. Go back to verse 14. This is the interpretation of the dream. And his fellow answered and said, There is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, right? Save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel, for into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. Now, the conversation that these 2 men had, do you think that it stayed just between those 2? No, right? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I would imagine that as soon as he got the interpretation of the dream, old buddy probably was out what? Telling everybody else, I don't know, guys. This is why I had this dream, and this is the sword of Gideon. He's the one guy. Obviously, divine intervention, right? This is a specifically phrased or specifically used phrase here that is going to continue to trigger some fear in these Midianites, right? And that's exactly why they said what they said. Third thing is they screamed out, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And you know, when they heard those two things, that it was like dogs' ears perking up, right? Oh no, here we go. This is the one thing that they said that they could possibly defeat us. This is the one thing that could cause problems. The Israelite soldiers remained in their assigned positions. They do these three things and they stand there, trusting God to give the victory. Now, as the Midianites looked around, they saw the 300 torches, probably thought each torch bearer was leading a huge contingency of soldiers. Of course, they had no idea how such a huge army could have come from, but they did not want to stay around to find out. They are now surrounded by 300 torches. They think each one of those torches got a garrison of men with them. They fled in a panic, afraid of God and of Gideon, because that story has now infiltrated the entire camp. The fear causes them to swing their drawn swords at anything that moves. Okay? For the most part, this point of the night, most of the fires would have probably been out. Most of the guys are either asleep or completely passed out, or the majority of the camp would have been pretty much in a deep sleep. So they wake up and can't see very much because there aren't any fires going and it's dark. Okay? I'm sure there's probably no moon in the sky by reason. And they just start swinging and hacking away at anything that moves because they don't know exactly what's going on, right? Unwittingly, because of that, they start to slay each other as they ran. Word of the attack spreads very, very quickly, and the other Israelites join the pursuit, as we saw in verse number 23. The tribes mentioned there in verses 23 are the same tribes that made up the original 32,000 men. Those who had been dismissed earlier were likely the ones who were actually chasing the fleeing Midianites. They were no doubt emboldened by Gideon's faith. They then hunt down and kill the remaining fleeing Midianites. Gideon even sends messengers up to Ephraim requesting help in the cleanup campaign, right? Anybody who's left, right? Help get things cleaned up. They were to guard the river's ford, and that when the enemy would try to cross in retreat, they were there waiting on him. Ephraim was located just south of where the main battle had begun, and these men would know where to wait for the Midianites. Go ahead, Chad. All right, and this is the area that we're talking about. Get down there at Ephraim. They're really surrounded, and down at Ephraim, they were waiting for everybody else, kind of the leftovers, to come running to them. These men would have been given the names to reflect their ravaging ways. Justice was served by their deaths, and Gideon received the heads as a gruesome but unmistakable evidence of Israel's victory. Go to verse 25. And they took the two princes of Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb, and they slew Oreb upon the rock Oreb, and Zeeb they slew at the winepress of Zeeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. So they got the leaders, got their heads, bring them into Gideon, and cut the head off of the leader, right? This army is destroyed. They have now successfully won the battle. What do the Israelites here learn about God through their victory? What should they have learned? That God is a true God, and that what? They should fear Him above all else, right? They should fear Him above all else. During the 7 previous years, the Israelites had feared the Midianites. And after they saw God work, their fear of Him no doubt increased dramatically. The Israelites' lives now have been changed as they began to fear God more than their enemies, and realizing His blessings and enjoying His presence. Go ahead, Chad, last one. And give it a click. All right, so our final here is this now successful battle for Gideon and the Israelites. We see now that they should fear God by believing in what He says. And this was a winding road for Gideon, right? It took him some time, took him some trials, took him some learning, and had to get taught some things. But eventually he comes to a point where he fears God above all else. And because of that, we see success that happens in his victory against the Midianites. All right. Next week we will jump into chapter number 8 and 9, where we will now begin to see Israel's need for a righteous king. In the first 3 points that we're going to look at in chapter 8 next week is that Israel was, and think the success they just had. We get to chapter 8, and the first 3 points: Israel being covetous, Israel being incredulous, Israel being idolatrous. Right back into where we started at. Then we'll see Abimelech and his wickedness, how he gets judged, and the need for a righteous king as well. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the lesson here we have of Gideon. Thank you for being able to see his faith grow in such a way in which he became ultimately extremely successful against insurmountable odds, simply because he just finally got to the point where he would believe that you were going to do what you said you were going to do. And I pray that's a lesson for us as well, and a continued reminder for us too. The requirement of Christianity at its core: obedience and faith in you. We do those two things. If we're obedient, what you say we should do. For faith, put our trust and faith completely and entirely in you. Everything else taken care of. It's a hard thing for us to do oftentimes. We find ourselves winding through difficulties because of it, Lord. But that's what you want of us. That's what you require of us. That's what you desire for us to do, Lord. And I pray that is the desire of our hearts as well. Pastor Rob here as he comes in the next little bit as well, because it's the message for the morning, Lord. You keep us attentive to the word you have for us as well.